Good afternoon to you all. Thank you, Paolo, for passing the baton, and congratulations on the huge success of the LAIR conference. It was a fantastic conference full of contents. We hope that the second part of Procurement Days will be equally interesting. Thank you all for being here, and I leave immediately the floor, thanking him for being here with us today, to the Dean of the Faculty of Economics of the University of Rome Tor Vergata, Professor Giovanni Tria, an economist himself. Thank you, Professor Tria, for being here.
Thanks, Gustavo. What I want to do is to welcome, really welcome all of you, all the speakers and all the participants to this very important conference. I think it's a very important conference. Of course, always we say that, but this time is, I think, really that, because the very important issues that you will discuss during the day. And I think it's very important issues, not only for the procurement scholars, procurement practitioners and experts that are here, but for all of us interested in growth. This is, I think, the main importance of this conference. Of course, the same importance that we put on training and studies on these fields. We can say that procurement is an engine for growth. Maybe it can consider a little bit exaggerated, but not so exaggerated, because, as you know, an important factor, maybe major factor, of the declining rate of growth around the world, especially in advanced countries, is the decline of investment. Private investment and public investment. If you read what the last studies about public investment, I think that we can receive an impression. IMF, for example, openly denounced the fall of public investment around the world. Public investment, especially in infrastructure, and more in general, public investment. The decline, the fall in comparison with the previous level before the crisis, but even this decline as a trend declined before the last crisis, during the last decades. As a consequence, all the international institutions call for increasing this investment, public investment in infrastructure, to relaunch a sustainable growth, short-term and long-term growth. This implies a big role, of course, for public procurement, in general sense, because the budget constraint, of course, then procurement can help to save money, but above all, because this positive effect on growth of public investment in infrastructure depends on the quality and on the efficiency of the infrastructure projects, on their right size, the real assessment of the specific needs that they should satisfy, etc. Moreover, we have to consider the globalization context of this program. And this means that we have to consider the global suppliers, foreign suppliers, but also local suppliers and small and medium enterprises as suppliers, in a way in which the various interests should be taken into account and balanced. The early stage of the procurement life cycle, I think, can provide, for example, the greatest opportunity for influencing growth. For example, in many cases, early engagement with the marketplace, with the private sectors, and publishing pipelines of future requirements allows the marketplace to better prepare for future demand. And this early engagement with the marketplace levels also the playing field for country-based suppliers, for small and medium enterprises, and also for foreign suppliers. Then we need a genuine two-way conversation with a diverse range of suppliers. We think this kind of two-way conversation can give maximum opportunity for the success, from the point of view of impact on growth, of infrastructure and public expenditure in general. For this reason, I started saying that this conference is an important conference for all of us. Then, I think there is for what I said, there is a huge interest and demand around the world for procurement specialists and experts with international background. Then, I confirm again the support of the School of Economics of University of Rome Tor Vergata to this program, to this conference. And I like to say that we are proud also of the various programs that we have on procurement at the School of Economics, in training, in research, in education. And for this, I want to finish with real thanks to Professor Piga and the other colleagues who organized all these programs on procurement for their excellent job. I want to also repeat my welcome to all the speakers and the participants to this wonderful conference, and I wish you full success of the conference. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Tria. I hope you can. Yes. The luck of working in procurement in a university where the dean strongly believes in the value of procurement is, I can really stress it to all of you, extremely important. And your support and support that we receive from the university and from the faculty has certainly pushed ahead this engine that you have recognized. So welcome to you all. I'll be very quick. I'll be the chair of today's two sessions. So we're back. Global Procurement Conference number 2 is here. Just a few. Yesterday I was thinking, what am I going to say in 30 seconds? And I said, well, why global procurement? So the first thing I did, obviously, is I went to look on Google, what is the definition of of global procurement, and this is what I found. And I hope that you understand that this is a limiting definition for us. It's a limiting definition. It's probably very much related to how global procurement is perceived in the private procurement arena, in the private sector arena. Look at this, just to understand. This is the sentence I found on Forbes in an interview of a private procurer that was defining successful global procurement transformation. And he was saying, well, what is global procurement about? What? Well, here it is. It's a fact-based solution not guided by emotion, beliefs, or politics. This is exactly the contrary of what we are about. This is exactly the contrary of what we recognize procurement to be. Yes, sometimes we don't want too many emotions, but I'm looking at my friend. But this is a definition that I would, I don't know, I thought about what do we put in the arena as a definition, and I would much prefer a definition that would recognize the immense interdisciplinarity of our profession, the value of local cultures in affecting the outcomes. We listened, for example, to some astonishing proposal very far away from here, in Japan, that may not be applicable in other parts of the world, but were fascinating anyway. The recognition that organizations, where they are, matters. So we have to, as Professor Tria reminded us very well, we have to talk about local preferences. We have to talk about multilateral organizations that keep a dialogue with them. And yes, we keep in mind the issue of globalization, which affects us all, which makes us here together. And by the way, we are going even further global as Tor Vergata. First of all, let me say hello. We are, in one reason, very global, because our heart and soul is all the International Master Public Procurement Management students. We are now recognizing a 5th edition coming to the end. They come from all over the world, and they have enriched with their local values, their local cultures, the value of what we do and our understanding of what we do. So having here so many representatives of them, not only of the last generation, sounds particularly important for us. But let me also say that Tor Vergata has just implemented a new master for the Balkans with the Faculty of Law of the University of Belgrade, which we're going to launch in the fall of 2017. And we're very, very glad of this global dimension that we are pushing forward. Who are we pushing this forward to, all these things that we do? Well, first of all, with our partners, and I must recognize our number one partner in this mission of professionalization in procurement, which is EBRD, and in particular this gentleman who is in my right, who has had the vision to push forward a proposal that we had discussed together many, many years ago in the beautiful Villa Mondragone, Jan Jackal, to whom I don't know how to say, my warmest thanks goes for the courage and the vision that he has had all over these years. Thank you so much, Jack. We've had other friends who are growing, and Lear is here. Paolo Buccirossi is not only a teacher at our master, he's a man that has understood much before many in the professions of consulting, of the role, of the importance of confronting issues of procurement with the competition side in mind. And we have started working together very much, and this wonderful output of the conference today, I think, is the cherry on the cake of 2017, but possibly in the future. I have a colleague that supports me constantly, without whom this master would be zero. This is the vice director of the program, Annalisa Castelli. That is the strong column of the master itself. And I wish, finally, for you all, on behalf also of Paolo Buccirossi, again, to give the warmest applause and thanks to the staff that has worked so hard for constructing these procurement days. Cristiana, Maria Cristina, and Simona have done a wonderful job. Silvia, I got it wrong. Silvia, I'm sorry, I got it wrong completely, but somebody tipped me wrong. So now we start with the global procurement. First session, Debarment in public procurement. The rules of the game are pretty easy. 30 minutes for each one of the speakers. I will send the speaker a 5-minute warning when there is 5 minutes left. And 30 minutes for debate and questions. And we expect many questions to arrive from the floor. So I leave the floor to Tina Soreide, not after having briefly introduced her, even if she was in procurement days even before. She's professor of law and economics at the Norwegian School of Economics, the Department of Accounting, Auditing and Law, and we all know her because of her research over the years on corruption, governance, markets and development, including law enforcement. She's been engaged in policy work, and we remember her work, her important work also at the World Bank and development agencies all over the world. And so very gladly I thank her for being here, and I leave her the floor. Thank you, Tina, for being with us.
Thank you, Gustavo, for this nice introduction. Here, yes, my slides. Maybe we can begin from the start. Yeah. Can you take it from the start? There we go. Thank you. Well, as a corruption expert, it is very nice that we have I think it is the first time I am attending a public procurement conference where we begin with the question of how can we exclude bidders? That is, of course, not the aim. But as you know, it is the case that as a consequence of being found guilty in corruption and some other forms of crime, firms and individuals can be debarred from participating in future public tenders. And this is now the case in countries all over the world. This is not only in Europe and so on, it is the case in countries and all income levels. And this is a topic I have studied a bit. It started when I was at the World Bank because I found it very interesting the way they debar, the World Bank debars suppliers. They offer loans to governments, and when the governments mismanage the funds, they debar the companies. And, well, you know, this is, to put it a bit sharply, of course, there are limits to what a development bank can do, and this is one of the tools they have. So it is understandable, but from a kind of, from my perspective as a governance expert and economist, it appeared as a not a sustainable solution because there were no evidence that it would actually have an impact. And when the World Bank investigators sent evidence that they had found upon investigation to the countries, and they still do that, of course, they try to collaborate with investigators in the countries where the corruption takes place. And they send the evidence back, but there's rarely any enforcement reaction when they do. So that is a problem. So, and this tool has been celebrated so much in policy reports as an efficient tool against corruption. So that is why I found it quite interesting to study this debarment mechanism. So I did a study on the World Bank, which is now published in the Chicago Journal of International Law. And then I returned to Norway and looked at the rules in Norway, and I realized that they function much worse than in the World Bank. The procedures are worse, and the predictability and enforcement is worse. And so there was a lot to, these rules didn't function well in Norway either, even if that is a country that scores quite well on various governance indicators. So I did a study, an analysis of Norwegian law, and thereafter I studied together with a law professor, we studied the EU Public Procurement Directive, and it's mostly on that basis I will talk today. And also I will discuss a paper with Emmanuel Auriol at the Toulouse School of Economics, which is a market analysis. What are the market effects of debarment? And that is actually a very interesting question because these rules were developed without a clear understanding of the market effects. And that is the lack of an understanding of the mechanisms at play that really influences the way they function as well. And you know, many of you at least know that governments should never start a policy reform without talking to the economists. So that is something that we now are doing afterwards, and our recommendations. So I have two papers. One, a book chapter in a book by Gabriella Racca and Christopher Eukins. So that is, I have some copies of that one, which is, but let me know if you want a copy. And there's also the just published paper in the International Review of Law and Economics, which is the market analysis. Now, so this is something that we need to see from two perspectives. And when we look at it from the law perspective, we can read that the purpose of the debarment rules is not meant to be a penalty. The purpose of debarment rules is protection of state finances and government legitimacy. So in law, there is a difference between retribution and preventive effects. In economics, however, we think that it is, the question is whether this tool actually gets rid of the problem we want to get rid of. Is it efficient? Will it prevent the crime? And from an economic perspective, it is actually seen as nearly perverse to punish simply for the case of punishment, while in law, that makes sense. So that is also two different perspectives that affect the development of these rules. Now, let me see. Yeah. So, in Europe, under the EU Procurement Directive, Debarment is regulated in Article 57, and it says that contracting authorities shall exclude an economic operator from participating in a procurement procedure where they have established by verifying in accordance with Articles 59, 60, and 61 on evidence and state reactions, or other ways, so they should exclude if it is verified that there has been committed corruption or some certain form of acts, or if procurement agents are otherwise aware of that the economic operator has been the subject of a conviction by final judgment of one of the following reasons. And the reasons they can be for debarment is participation in a criminal organization, it is corruption, fraud, money laundering or terrorist financing, and child labor. So all these reasons can lead to debarment of, there's this. By the law, by the Public Procurement Directive, there is mandatory debarment. However, there is also a question, when it comes to the question of how can a supplier be undebarred, when will it end? That is a question of self-cleaning. And this is something I discussed briefly yesterday in my presentation. But this is described also in the directive as any economic operator that is in one of the that can provide evidence to the effect that measures taken by the economic operator are sufficient to demonstrate its reliability despite the existence of relevant ground for exclusion cannot be debarred. So there is mandatory debarment, but also huge discretion for for considering a supplier eligible upon self-cleaning. So there are some rules on self-cleaning as well, which includes collaboration with investigators, offer compensation for damage, remove certain employers, those who have been involved in the case, and certain internal administrative reorganizations. That can lead to self-cleaning. And then the supplier can be re-eligible for debarment. So this is a bit confusing because we should debar, but there's also broad opportunity for self-cleaning, and there is wide discretion both on debarment and self-cleaning. So how to understand this is a bit difficult, and it has to be, on top of this, it has to be seen in light of the EU fundamental constitutional principles on equal treatment. We cannot make a difference between suppliers if they are in principle equal. So a company that has taken steps to be seen as to be eligible for bidding should be allowed to compete. So that is a difficulty in the debarment, and also the principle of proportionality, which means that a company should not be treated harsher than necessary, whatever is necessary. Now, that is the law part. In the policy world, this has been celebrated quite a lot, and there are many reports that simply states that this is an efficient strategy against corruption. Even if there's really no evidence, there's no clear impact assessment, has been done on debarment in public procurement. But there are many, many reports saying that it has a very important effect, even if we don't know it. So there's very little literature on the empirical side of it. And when we look at debarment in practice, around the world, the rules on debarment vary quite significantly, even if we have debarment, and I will get to that a bit afterwards. There is room for differences across European countries, but also around the world, we see that there is a significant difference when it comes to the options for debarment. When is it mandatory? When the degree of discretion? There is variation when it comes to the use of registries, whether countries have lists of the companies that should be debarred. In many countries, there are no such lists. And when there is no registry, then the procurement, then the debarment it can be up to the competitors if they complain and not. So it's not the information that a bidder should be debarred will not necessarily come from the bidder itself. So especially if there are huge gray zones in the question of who should be debarred. Now, and also there is significant variation when it comes to the time limit for debarment. And even if some countries have this time period, there is this discretionary judgment of when a company should be seen as re-eligible for bidding. And also when we look at the practices, it is very difficult to find evidence because there's very, very little empirical information about debarment. But so for the studies that we have done, we have tried to search and find examples of the problems. And what we find is that there is huge enforcement failure. So many countries simply talk about debarment and they don't really debar companies in practice. And when it comes to, for example, Transparency International complained to the European Union in 2014 that they said the European Union spends 2.5 trillion a year on goods and services, and it had, at that time, blacklisted only 6 companies. And when considering the OECD report, the report that it was referred to yesterday by those who were here, but there is a report on 427 foreign bribery cases, and only in 2 of those cases a company was debarred. So there's actually, that is a problem that the laws are, there are examples of debarment, companies are debarred, but it's not very predictably enforced, and it's so many, yeah. I will get to some of the reasons. One, when there is a high market concentration, it's far more difficult for the governments to enforce these rules. So like in Brazil, there is all the construction companies were involved in both cartel and corruption, and the country could simply could not debar all of them. And what we see in practice is that when there are few bidders, there is more deviation from these rules. So if there are 3 or 4 bidders, the governments don't want to debar any of them. And this is especially in utilities and infrastructure. And we saw this in Norway, for example, in an example in defense sector. They simply did not want to debar. They ignored the rules. And there are no consequences if governments debar the rules. So far, there are no consequences from the EU as I am aware of. So, and the debarment rules, they stipulate exclusion regardless of where the corruption has taken place. So my government in Norway, they are supposed by the EU procurement rules to exclude a bidder that has been involved in corruption on the other side of the globe, in Argentina, whatever. And there is low willingness to do that. And also we see that the procurement's discretion is huge, because what is really a company in this context? What is a bidder? What if they form a new company, a sub-company, like 2 Rheinmetall and MAN, 2 companies in the defense sector that were both involved in corruption? They simply established a daughter company and they evaded the debarment rules that way. And we also saw, as was also discussed for those who were here yesterday, we discussed how the settlements, if a company has settled a case on crime with a criminal law investigator and promised to behave better with monitoring, better compliance systems and whatever, then they are nearly automatically seen as self-cleaned and re-eligible for bidding. So that is one of the reasons why there are so few debarment cases in procurement, because now most cases with firms are settled, especially when it comes to international bribery. And And also, of course, there can be implications for leniency in the competition law if there is debarment upon cartel collaboration. That is the case, for example, under the World Bank rules. They can debar on cartels. That is not the case under EU procurement rules. So in practice, there are many problems. But what I studied with Emmanuel Auriol was the question, to what extent will debarment deter corruption if the rules are enforced as stipulated? And this is exactly the question that Paolo Bucurossi asked yesterday also. And in this paper, we discussed, we did an analysis. I will not go into the details, but it is, we have a two-sided procurement story in the analysis, which means that the procurement agent can actually take bribes. Many of these procurement rules are introduced as if we can have 100% confidence in procurement agents, because they are the ones who decide whether there should be an exemption from the rules, and they are also the ones who decide whether a company should be re-eligible for bidding, but they are also the ones that the companies may want to bribe. But that last part is not really taken into account when the rules have been written, which is weird. But in this model, we take that into account. And it is an international industrial organization approach. So this could be set up in different ways, but this is a market analysis of the problem. If it was studied from a law and economic perspective, we may get a kind of different analysis, but this is a study of the competition effect. And in this, so we have an endogenous end. That means that as companies are being debarred, the number of players in the market decreases. And we have, of course, repeated purchases in this model. We assume that, that the public procurement agent can have some discretionary authority. And you know, corruption in public procurement can happen in many different ways. But we focus on the sole source procurement, the decision to allocate contracts to a specific supplier, and assume some discretionary authority. And of course, we also assume that the procurement agent is informed and that it will be enforced. So many of the problems with enforcement are not really part of the model. But we focus on the competition effect. So what we find, I don't know how many minutes I have?
More than 10, 11.
Oh, that's wonderful. So, yes. What we find in this study is that, of course, this is very intuitive. We have in the paper, there is a long and sophisticated economic model, but that is basically my co-author's fault. Because at Toulouse, they love the economic model. No, it was necessary to be specific about the analysis and the precision of the argument. But when you look at the results, they are very intuitive. Because obviously, the effect of debarment will depend on the number of players in a market. And if we have many companies many bidders in a market, what do you think? Do you think the debarment effect is stronger or weaker if there are many companies in a market? How many think it is stronger the more companies in a market? No. No, the debarment effect is weaker the more companies you have in a market, because the next contract doesn't. Imagine for a company, if you have the choice, if there is very hard competition and you have the choice between offering a bribe and win a contract, sole source negotiation, the difference between that and competition price in on a competitive level, the difference is very high. And at the same time, if you are debarred, what do you lose if you don't pay bribes? Well, you lose the profit you would get in a highly competitive market, which is not that much. So the benefits of bribery is much bigger than the risk of of being excluded. So for the companies, the more companies in the market, the lower the debarment effect. That's quite simple. Similarly, when the number of companies decreases, then, of course, for the company, they may have reasons to pay bribes, but that is more risky because they will gain more in an honest competition. So the risk of paying bribes is higher if they are excluded. The value of the next contract is much higher when there are few competitors, right? So that is one of the reasons. Makes it also very simple. But the firm's discount rate, which means how much they value the next contract, that may depend on the owners and so on. But there will be variation across countries on that, companies on that part. So that is also important. If they don't value the next contract, debarment will have no effect, right? And of course, the risk of detection and predictable enforcement, obviously, if there's no enforcement, it will not have an effect. And the risk of detection, when it comes to corruption cases, that risk, unfortunately, can be very low. But for now, let us assume that it is higher and consider the effect. But in this model, we actually find threshold effects in the sense that if the level of detection is below a certain point, debarment will have no impact on deterrence, and it will only harm competition. So that is a problem. So if we have this tool, at least we should make sure that there is a certain deterrent effect. Now, debarment, yeah. Yes, and of course, the debarment will not affect the government decision makers. So now in analytic world, we just simply focus on this specific tool. It will not have any impact on the procurement agency. So if they are already corrupt, they will simply continue to be corrupt. So if this tool works and they continue to be corrupt, there will be fewer and fewer and fewer competitors. So obviously, as Paolo pointed out yesterday, this is a tool that actually, of course, it has an anti-competitive effect that we have to consider. And that is also why this self-cleaning is so important. How can we bring these suppliers back to the market as soon as possible? So what we find in this model is that the deterrent effect there is a deterrent effect only when the number of competitors is below a certain level. And that, as I mentioned when I discussed the enforcement problem, that is exactly the situations when the enforcement problems are at their worst. So, yes, of course, I also have to mention that when we have when the number of bidders decrease, there is a higher risk of, you're supposed to say, collusion, cartel collaboration. So there is the fewer bidders in the market, the higher the risk of cartel collaboration. So we have, there are two forms of anti-competitive effects. Now, so the policy difficulty, I just need a few more minutes, I guess. Thank you. So what we find is that the debarment tool works under the circumstances, as I mentioned, when the enforcement failure are at the worst. So what should we do? This paper is consistent with the discussion I had yesterday, and we think it is very important to bring the procurement decision out of the procurement agencies. It's simply extremely naive to think that procurement agents should make all decisions on procurement. They should decide on the criteria for bid, for all the criteria. They should decide whether companies are eligible for bidding and whether companies, how long they should be debarred, and they should make, it's very naive to give this much authority to procurement agents. Probably some of you are representing procurement agencies, but I'm sorry, this is actually the case. We need to have some form of checks and balances on this tool. So if we are to use this as a tool, we cannot really rely on the procurement agents to handle it, because they have incentives to deviate from the rules. Immediately when in the situations when the tool will make a difference from a market analytic perspective, in those situations, that is the situations when the procurement agents have the highest incentives to deviate from the tool. So it doesn't make sense to give that. It will not really function without some form of checks and balances. Of course, it is possible to have checks and balances on procurement agents, but this idea that procurement agents cannot be corrupted, that is a bit naive. So we will not have. We are not certain about the specific solutions, but we think it is necessary to make some changes in the form of procurement, debarment. So taking it out of the procurement agency is one solution, but also it is possible to debar leaders, and not only in the situations when it's not possible to, when government simply cannot afford to exclude, if there are two producers of life-saving medicine, the government cannot exclude one of them, then it's champagne on the others. But so in those situations, maybe it's possible to exclude directors of the company. It's possible to have a stricter self-cleaning system, monitoring system, combined with other tools. But acting as if the procurement rules function and is a solution, that is just a window dressing. It's not really a real tool. So something has to be done about the rules, that is obvious. Although we are uncertain about the specific solutions. So when it comes to the conclusions, we find in summary that these are a set of rules that may have some disciplinary impact on companies, in the sense of sending a signal that procurement agents want bidders to act in a certain way. So it may have some moral signal effect that we have not included in an economic analysis. That is possible. We should not ignore that. A lot of talk about it in development banks and government procurement agencies may actually make a difference, even if it's not measurable in the economic analysis. We don't know. However, we think it does not make sense to have so much reliance on a one-sided approach. A strategy against corruption that only targets the suppliers is simply not good enough. From an economic theoretical perspective, it is possible to deter corruption if we have perfect deterrence on one side, because it does take two parties to cut a corrupt deal. But in practice, it is impossible to deter one side perfectly, and for that reason, it is necessary to have to combine this tool with efficient solutions. This may be obvious for many of you, but in practice, there is really the debarment rules are referred to as if they are a solution alone, and that is not the case. When it is presented as such, it looks like as if they reveal some hesitance to address corruption within one's own state administration, or for the sake of development banks, that they don't really want to, I'm not pointing at you, that they don't want to address the political issue associated with corruption. It's much easier to attack the companies in a political context. So one of the things I want you to note is that under the EU Public Procurement Directive, it is possible for countries and member states to develop their own, to make the system more efficient. So it is possible to specify the rules so that they can function more efficiently on a country basis. There is room for that in the directive. So that's definitely something that you should consider in your societies. And also, I just want to add with the same message as yesterday that in terms of protecting markets against corruption and collusion, we have to consider how the different law enforcement mechanisms work in combination, and not only the design of the specific tools, even if that also is very important. Okay, so thank you.
Thank you, Tina, for providing us this mapping of the economics of debarment, providing us with the institutional solutions, and also reminding us of a couple of stylized facts, which I find interesting, which is the absence of an impact assessment of debarment and the fact that actually there's not very much debarment out there in the world. So now it's the turn of those who work on the ground. If I may say so, we have a joint presentation by Jan Jackholt of EBRD with Rohan Schapp. Let me introduce both of them very quickly. Most of you know Jan Jackholt. He's the director of the procurement function at EBRD, a European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. He has been with the bank for 17 years. 18. My God, time flies. Rohan Schapp is the director, investigations, at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. His responsibility include managing EBRD's investigations into allegations of fraud and corruption by EBRD counterparts, as well as investigation into alleged misconduct by EBRD staff. And prior to joining in 2008 EBRD, which I find very interesting, you worked as financial investigator with UNDP, and before that with the International Criminal Tribunal for former Yugoslavia. You have over 25 years of international investigation, regulatory, and compliance experience. They have decided to share the presentation with 10 minutes to Jack, 20 minutes to Ron. Yeah. 10 minutes for you. Thank you for being here, Jack.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Good after lunch, everyone. It's wonderful, absolutely wonderful to sit here and look out towards all of you. And frankly speaking, I do feel like an extremely successful father when I look at every one of my conscripts to the International Master Program in Public Procurement Management. How many are actually from? Raise your hands, everyone, from the program. Yeah. You see? Oh, so gosh. There, and how many are actually attached to the program in one way or the other? I mean, lecturing, working with, exactly. You see, it's a very fantastic group. It's wonderful. Yeah. So, thank you very much for coming. And especially I would like to say, I am so impressed that we actually have previous generations of students here who took or showed the commitment by coming here to this event. I think that is fantastic. Yeah. So, anyway, I feel like a successful father, as I said, but I also am a little bit of an ugly duckling on the panel, because at the end of the day, I'm sitting here between two debarment experts, Tina and Rohan, and I am by no means a debarment expert. You know? So I thought that what I will do is just to give you a little bit of some thoughts from a procurement practitioner's point of view, rather. Yeah? I don't think that I'm going to mention even debarment with the exception of the first slide. Yeah? So just for anyone who happens not to know after all the discussions we have had in the master program about what the bank is about. So European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, I'm just going to mention a few things on this slide. One thing very important, and that is that we are a bit of an avatar in the MDB world in respect of the fact that we are predominantly providing financing in the private sector. The other thing which is quite different is that we are not in the public sector, we are not only borrowing to countries, we are borrowing to public sector outfits. And I think that is very important in the context of the discussion about debarment, because it does have an impact on the way we see things. You know. The other thing I wanted to mention here is that we are called the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and you students, you know me, I've said this many times, that yes, we are called European and we are based in London, but the fact is it's not a European bank only. I mean, we have many other shareholders, Americans, Australians, Korean, etc. So it means it provides another added flavor to the composition of the bank, and the fact that we are not following EU directives, etc. We work in the public sector as a traditional MDB with our immunities, not like EIB, who is a financial instrument of the EU. And I also wanted to mention that you can see that we have expanded our operations geographically. The bank was set up to work in Eastern Europe, but we have added a number of countries which we call the CEMED countries, which you see here, which is Egypt, Morocco, Tunisia, and Jordan. And what I really would like to point out is that the next member is for sure going to be Lebanon. Yes. And I am truly looking forward to have Lebanon as one of our countries of operation, because that means that obviously we need to expand this map. These are the countries that we are operating in, and I'm pretty sure you know exactly which these countries are, but this is one type of map looking at these countries. This is another type of map to look at these countries, and I think now you probably already see what my point is going to be. We are, as all MDBs, working in very difficult environment for many reasons. The fraud and corruption and all what goes with it is only one of those difficult conditions to add to the environment that we are working in. And this map is clearly showing that red is obviously, like always, danger, meaning that these are the countries which are lowest on the corruption perception index on Transparency International. And if we add my friend from nowadays AIIB, but previously Asian Development Bank, you would certainly add a number of red countries to your list if we showed your geographical map. But this is very important to bear in mind, the context of how we form our rules, how we form our policies. That is very important. In the procurement world, as you well know, all of you being procurement specialists, the EBRD, as any other bank, we have our own procurement policies and rules. And they reflect the common principles, the key principles: economy, efficiency, non-discrimination, transparency, and accountability. In our case, economy, efficiency, non-discrimination, and transparency, these key principles are coming directly from the agreement establishing the bank, which was done back in 1989. What is not mentioned actually in the agreement establishing the bank, there is no direct link to fraud and corruption or prohibited practices, no direct link. There are some phrases which makes you aware of that this is an aspect that needs to be covered by the bank, but it doesn't exactly say fraud and corruption. You know? And why I'm saying that is that things were looking slightly different in the days when, let's say, the late 80s and the late 90s. And I will take this as an example. When I started to work with the international public procurement, which was 91, and I worked with the first World Bank loan to Latvia at that time, called a rehabilitation loan, where we were buying oil and gas and agriculture products and pharmaceuticals. In those days, there was not one word about fraud and corruption in the World Bank guidelines. In fact, I don't think ADB either had at that time any word about fraud and corruption. And it was the presumption that if these things occurred, they would be taken care of by the national system. But obviously, as we've seen from the map already, you probably shouldn't trust the national system in this context, especially 91, and especially then in the area where we were operating, the former Soviet Union, which was not having the laws and the judicial system to cover for this. The World Bank were the first one, as far as I know, unless ADB was before, but I think it was the World Bank who introduced first a provision which was only related to fraud and corruption. That was it, but they started for sure. In our case, in 95, we amended our procurement policies and rules to include the UN Chapter 7 provision. That is obviously not related to fraud and corruption as such, but it is a provision for sanctions. And then in 1997, we followed suit with the other MDBs and introduced the fraud and corruption provisions in our guidelines. And I just wanted to show you this, because at the end of the day, it's a bit surprising, really, that it's quite a recent phenomenon for the banks to look at this. It should really have been something that would be, let's say, more attention have been placed to earlier, really. But these are some historical facts. Anyway, and then just to think about it from an MDB point of view, and obviously in the context of procurement, what are our constraints when we are providing financing for contracts for goods, works and consultancy services? To start with, the bank is not a party to the contract financed, which means obviously that our legal relationship to this contract is zero. There are opportunities, though, and that is, for instance, that you can request clients to include things in the contract such as audit. And it's only if the client is actually including an audit provision allowing the bank to provide an audit of contractors' accounts that we can actually do it as banks. But obviously, and this may be very easy if we talk about open tender, where we apply our standard tender document, our contracts, but as you know, all the banks, they want to move towards the use of national systems. We may pick up contracts which are not, where we have not been involved in the beginning of the procurement, meaning that there is already a contract in place, meaning that fraud and corruption provisions may not have been there, auditing provisions may not have been in the contract. So that's definitely a constraint to take into account. Yeah. Another thing is that MDBs makes procurement decisions based on information provided. So we are not the one who are doing the evaluation of the actual tenders. Normally we don't even see the tenders unless there's a complaint and we need to look at specific parts of a tender. And also, at the end of the day, the client is making his decision on the basis of information provided by the tender. And there it's very important that clients are doing their job, making sure that the information provided are actually reflecting the truth, which we obviously, in our third-party position, do not know. Yeah. And also the bank's role ultimately is to provide financing. It's like a binary system. It's either on and off. We either provide financing or we don't. That's really the ultimate weapon that we can use. On top of that, obviously, in the range of punishments that we can apply as a bank comes exactly what has been talked about here before. Such things as debarments, sanctions, and one or two more provisions. But it's basically, at the end of the day, provide financing or do not provide financing. One thing is for sure, as a procurement specialist working with procurement and tendering every day, we see a lot of allegations. Am I already out of time? Yeah, okay. So. But of course, allegations are coming in various shapes and forms, and not all of them very let's say, coming with evidence. You know? So it's very hard actually to prove these allegations. Now I need to go very quickly because I'm already out of time. So I'm going to show you very quickly what are, in our view, let's say our prevention and detection measures. And I'm going to take just a few of this. Can I have 2 more minutes? That's okay, Rohan? 2 more minutes, thank you. So these are the stages which are very important for us. Project planning, obviously, that is a stage where you can detect if clients want to move things in one or the other direction. If it is for good reasons or if it is for bad reasons. That's what we need to be in there to try to detect. One thing which I think has been extraordinarily useful for all the banks over the years, and that is the establishment of harmonized standard tender documents. Because in those documents, we have built in, through experience, all the important aspects that needs to be taken into account, not only during the tendering phase, but also for the contract. You know, these are the contracts which represents what we believe are good values, both in terms of implementation, but also in terms of prevention for fraud and corruption. And it gives us the opportunity to build in things such as the auditing clause that I was talking about. Yeah. Now, I'm going to skip some of the others, but as you can see, exactly as Tina was saying, that we are very restrictive when it comes to approving direct contracting and only under certain provisions. We are very much against negotiations, very much only allowed under certain provisions, and we are probably, as EBRD, extraordinarily against subjective evaluation criteria. We have always been against this because we think that this is one of the best ways of actually building opportunities for fraud and corruption. Yeah? Third-party review, whether that is implementation support, independent procurement reviews, or NGOs, or any other form of third party. In my opinion, that is one of the most efficient ways of trying to stem fraud and corruption. Have a third party in the process. Yeah? These are some final thoughts. The first one, transparency also have drawbacks, but the benefits outweigh. I hear very often, I read in books about the damning effects on for instance, advertising which ones are on the short list, because then there could be collusion. In my opinion, my humble opinion, I think this is if I may say so, a load of rubbish. Yeah? Because in my opinion, if you really want to get in and do collusion, you will do it anyway, whether it's advertised or not. Yeah? One thing on e-procurement, that is an excellent tool in preventing process mistakes, but in my opinion, should not be directly linked to stopping fraud and corruption. If you want to do fraud and corruption, you can do it whether it's in the e-world or not. Yeah? And I would say that procurement is more often tainted by the purchaser's need to satisfy the political context or by poor practices than fraud and corruption. That is just my statement. I have no evidence to build this up on. It is just my sort of gut feeling after working with this kind of procurement for 25 years. You know. Now, I'm sorry for taking more time than I should have, and I will, with warm hands, hand over to Rohan, who is the real expert on this area. Thank you very much. Yeah?
Thank you, Jack. Let me bring my present. Oops. Is this on? Thanks. Okay, is it on? Okay, we can skip the first slide because I've already been introduced, so saving already. To take up on Jack's point, and I guess a little bit to Tina's point, one of the, if I bring this a little closer, one of the questions we get asked regularly as an MDB is, why are we involved in this area? What role do we have in combating fraud and corruption? And isn't it just a topic that national authorities need to deal with? Why is this a role of the EBRD? Well, firstly, we have a very strong interest in what goes on in our projects that we either fund or administer. This project here is one of our largest projects, the Chernobyl New Safe Confinement. It was entirely donor funded, and as the fund manager, EBRD was entrusted to manage billions of dollars of funds. It is important, and our stakeholders rightly expect, that we are accountable for the management of these funds and that we act appropriately and decisively when we are confronted with fraud and corruption. Unless we have very strong controls and very strong deterrent effects, we can't get the donor funds to fund these projects. And this project would not have been successful. There were numerous attempts at petty fraud, petty corruption on this project, and only with strict controls were we able to make sure it happened. The second reason we need to be involved is, unfortunately, there is still a lack of capacity, willingness and expertise by national authorities to address the issue. This slide shows a road that was constructed by the World Bank Group. I wasn't willing enough to show an EBRD project, but this is a World Bank project. I'll use one of their examples. And it shows the effects of corruption. Now, this road was, as you can see, 30% narrower than specifications. There was no road surfacing, contrary to specifications, but the contractor was paid in full. Moreover, it was signed off by the National Procurement Department. Now, who here thinks this was done under a private sector project, or was this a public sector project? I think it's fairly obvious that this sort of blatant corruption could only occur in the public sector, on the public sector field. So we believe that given that the lack of capacity and lack of willingness, still unfortunately in some national authorities, we need to assume this ground and take some responsibilities. So we can't do this alone. We need assistance from all our clients. We need them to be involved and we need them to help with us. But we need them to have some standards. And there are minimum standards we like to see from everybody. If you're getting a loan in the millions or in hundreds of millions from EBRD, we expect that you do have some controls in place. Internal controls, they should be mandatory and obvious. But more importantly, and what we don't see, is reporting mechanisms that allow for internal and external parties to be able to report suspicions and fraud, and for them to be able to do so without retaliation. It is still, after so many years, I'm still amazed at how controversial whistleblowing protection is as an issue. And again, we expect our clients to have some sort of effective mechanism to resolving complaints and fraud. I don't think the MDBs want to be the policemen of the world. It's not a role we are particularly good at or claim to have any expertise in. And we would like to see this being done more and more by the people that are directly responsible, are able to prosecute and deal with these matters under their rules. So that brings us on to what would we expect when you're subject as a national body to an investigation. Well, I think it's fairly obvious what you should do. Again, the one point I would like to make up is that we do like to insist that all individuals who are directly involved are suspended and they don't partake further in our project. It causes our stakeholders it causes us an enormous loss of confidence from our stakeholders if they see that the corrupt mayor or the corrupt minister is still really involved in the EBRD project despite having been arrested and publicly named in relation to another project. We also expect continual improvements. Hopefully over time, as entities see more and deal more with fraud and corruption, they learn lessons and they improve. Of course, as an MDB financier, and as Jack explained, we have rights and obligations too. We would like to be told immediately when there's fraud and corruption. This is very important so we can manage the relationship with our stakeholders. We can manage the situation internally. We expect our clients to fully cooperate, and the rest are the same standards. So what are the prohibited practices? Well, we hear a lot about fraud and corruption, and I think they're fairly well understood. EBRD's had to expand its list, most controversially, amongst the other MDBs, to include theft and misuse of EBRD resources. In public sector tendering, we do see theft. It's just when subcontractors or contractors steal project equipment. We need to deal with that. And we see misuse of EBRD resources. A typical example you may see is when a contractor expends the funds that have been lent to it on another project, declares bankruptcy, and they can't complete the EBRD project. That happens a lot, I guess, in our road projects. We see that in Moldova, we've seen, in Ukraine, that sort of thing, by tenderers not completing their responsibilities. So we have a standard triage approach. If you make a complaint of fraud and corruption, we assess it, we see whether it's for us to deal with, and we respond. Some important points about what an EBRD investigation is and is not. we are not responsible for the conduct of public sector officials or its clients or its personnel. That is the role for national authorities. We have no jurisdiction or ability to deal with them. So we see this kind of divergence of approach that Tina referred to, I guess, where the contractor or the company involved is heavily sanctioned and penalised and is debarred, and it may cause it some damage. But the public sector official is often allowed to get away almost scot-free and is able to pursue this activity again for the next client. We see this and we recognise this as a problem. Our major tool is debarment of contractors. Whether that works or not, I think is open debate, but that is how we combat fraud and corruption. I won't go to these next two slides. It's curious how we have, as Jack's pointed out, it's curious how we have authority to investigate this. As Jack pointed out, we don't have any privity with these contractors. We're not in contract with them. So we get authority via a very circuitous route. The route is, and it's explained there, is that in our procurement rules, we have a right of what they say inspection, and we have a right of audit. And we ask that the bank's clients impose that in their contracts and subcontracts. It works to some extent, in other cases not as well. We also include these clauses in our covenants. So now we get to where the rubber hits the road, sanctions. Well, we've talked a lot about debarments, but sanctions are more than debarments. And they tend to range from a reprimand and all the way to permanent debarment, being permanently ineligible for EBRD funding. We think we like to tailor the debarments depending on the circumstances. Conditional non-debarment is a sanction we often impose. We think it has a very good effect at reforming our entities we work with. I've heard the term a lot that the debarments are punishment or the punitive. The debarments should not be punitive. For us, they're administrative in nature. They're not criminal sanctions. Of course, there is a deterrence effect that we name and shame these entities, but there is no criminal sanction. They're not criminally debarred, and it is just an administrative outcome. There is, and as I'll get onto that, possible cross-debarment with other MDBs. If I understood Tina correctly, I think she said that debarments in the MDBs do make a difference. And I think that is true. And I think one of the ways that they may have some impact is that firms that are debarred are publicly named and shamed. This is the list that I've just taken from the World Bank's debarment, and it shows the entity, its address, who it is, and the terms that it's been debarred. Its effect goes beyond just the MDBs. We know that it is noted by most other major financial institutions who, before engaging with one of these clients, will ask them about the debarment and what's it about before deciding whether they would like to engage with the entity. As explained, who can be sanctioned already. So what is mutual enforcement? Well, mutual enforcement was a very interesting project from the MDBs where we would try to leverage our debarment regime by recognising each other's debarments. The banks involved are listed there, and it only applies to debarments of more than 1 year. So we see a tendency now to debar entities for less than 1 year. It's relied on the harmonised definitions. So the only 4 prohibited practices that can be debarred are corruption, fraud, collusion and coercion. It's meant to widen the net to catch fraud and corruption worldwide. We think it poses a strong deterrence, maybe others not so as much. That's who can go. Importantly, again, the cross-debarment does not cover the actions of government officials. Again, we see that as for national authorities to deal with. It does not, again, apply to sanctions of 1 year or less. Here is our list. It's publicly available. We have now, to date, as of today, have cross-debarred 822 entities and 361 individuals based on the debarments of other MDBs. So the big question, I think this is what Tina's point was, is what is the impact of all of this system? Are we making a real difference? Well, there are some good signs here. We have a public list. Entities are ineligible for financing. They cannot get our funding again if they've engaged in a practice that we don't like. There's cross-debarment. Their release is subject to improvements. They need to normally they're required to improve their internal controls. It may also affect their affiliates if they're in a large group. It may, hopefully, lead to national enforcement action. And therefore, we would hope that it raises the confidence in our programs and our projects and allows our stakeholders to continue to lend, to invest with us and to work with us. But of course, we're not naive to think that we capture all debarments or all wrongdoing. We think, as the slide illustrates, we get the tip of the iceberg. And it's what is underneath that we don't see, the unseen prohibited practices. And that is the real challenge for MDBs. How are we going to deal with the fraud and corruption and wrongdoing on our projects that we don't see? And as I heard the word binary, but debarment is binary. Either you're debarred or you're not debarred. It is a very blunt tool for us. It is not really an effective way of dealing with many of the situations we come across. And it should not be the end of the journey for us. Even if engaging is prudent, would you still do it? And an analogy that I like to draw is that if you're going to get a house built and you know the builder's been in jail, he's been bankrupt, he's sloppy, he doesn't finish on time, and he overruns in costs, would you ever engage him to build your house? Probably not. But unfortunately, in public sector procurement, we're not able to discriminate against any of those grounds. So there are other ways that we need to improve the practices of our contractors. Of course, prevention is better than cure. So we like to screen both our projects up front to see what their controls are. What do our clients have in terms of internal controls and practices that will give us confidence that they'll execute the project correctly? And hopefully we've raised the cost of misconduct through debarment. One thing that EBRD is paying a lot of attention to these days is the demand-sided corruption. In the past, it seemed to me that if you were a major contractor and you wanted to get a contract, you'd work out who the minister was and you'd work out how to pay him. And that was the end of the story. Well, I hope those days are gone and we don't see that as much anymore. But that minister is still there and he still expects to be paid. So we need to come up with strategies that will help address the demand side, this pull factor of corruption. And what we've tried to do is highlight the extent that corruption exists within a country, both through the Transparency International that Jack referred to, but the other studies that are there. We advocate for improvements. We're doing a lot of work to support the creation and work of new institutions, and we like to improve the integrity of our government and our government clients through anti-corruption action plans, training and compliance. This is just some of the work we've done recently. The investment climate and governance initiatives are very exciting for us. We're working in several countries to help establish business ombudsmen in Ukraine and investment councils. We hope that this will change the community standards, as the cartoon highlights. We often ask our clients to have corruption compliance programs, and they trot out the standard corruption compliance programs, what exists on paper. But for us, that's not that important. It's what has been implemented that is important. Too often we go to see our clients and they get the folder down from the shelf and it is in pristine condition, prepared by an international law firm, and it has all the best practices of anti-corruption plan you would expect. But it's never been opened. It's never even been read. It's been bought. That to us has no practical use. So we like to see ownership of the project. And there are some of the points that we like to see in an anti-corruption plan. Just a quick slide to address some of the points that Tina was making. I think we do try and tailor our approach to fraud and corruption so we can have the best impact for the underlying activity. In the first example, ACTA Ukraine, it's a subsidiary of a major US conglomerate, ADM Mills, I believe. It paid a bribe of $22 million using in part EBRD funds, and it didn't report. So we think a 3-year debarment is appropriate. The other 3 entities listed there, they were more victims, what we saw, of demand-side corruption. They were extorted, if you like. And is it fair in that sort of climate and that sort of environment that they be debarred? May have, in these cases, forced them to close down their business. There would have been loss of jobs. Or can we deal with this in another way? So we impose 3-year conditional non-debarment. It is a sanction. We think it works, but it is not a debarment as such. So just coming up to the end of my presentation, here are the resources that we think are useful. We've worked with these and we think these are the best the best examples we can find. We particularly like in OCO, my department, the ISO, the new standard on anti-bribery systems, 37001. We think that this standard, together with the compliance standard, which I think is 16001, are really useful standards that any entity can implement. It's certifiable. Most industries are very familiar with the standard system anyway. They have the quality assurance standard 9000 or the environmental standard, so that they're familiar with the process. Some of the others. This is my last slide, and I'd just like to highlight that people tend to think about debarments as being a recent or a new or innovative system. In fact, debarments or sanctions have been around for as long as since God expelled Adam and Eve. But one of the things we keep on getting to is that they are only a part of the system. Sanctions have been around forever, but we still have fraud and corruption. And why is that? Well, sanctions can never be the panacea for all fraud and corruption. They're an important part of that, they're an important instrument, but they must be used with other tools and other methods, such as improving the investment climate, working with internal controls, and having stricter standards. Thank you.
That was quite a long punishment to get back to the Garden of Eden. Thousands of stimuli from this presentation. I think Tina argued about putting some distance between procurers and the decision of debarment. You argued that we do not want to be the policeman of the word, but at some point there is a role that your distance allows for debarment to become more effective and actually be seen in practice. So I think there's many data out there. Maybe Tina will also want to react at some point from the presentation she's heard. Now it's time to leave the floor to questions. So we have a mic somewhere. No, you're not the mic. You want the mic, yes. Chris Hukins. Oh, please state your first name and your institution.
I'm Chris Hukins from George Washington University. For Tina, your suggestion was that the debarment function be shifted to the competition authority. And is Bill Kovacic still here? No, Bill Kovacic. Bill Kovacic was he was the chair of our competition authority, the Federal Trade Commission. And if you had asked Bill if the Defense Department would allow the FTC to debar Boeing or Lockheed Martin, he'd say they would kill him first. Okay, that can't happen. There's no way the procuring agencies would give up that prerogative over their supply chain. It's politically impossible. And I'm not sure it's the best idea from a theoretical standpoint, because if debarment is supposed to address performance risk and reputational risk, the procuring agency is in the best position. And I apologize for that. Was less of a question than a statement. For Ron, I have a question, a practical question. You identified the ISO standards. I looked up the ISO standards while you were speaking. They're 168 Swiss francs, which I think is like 10,000 US dollars. I'm kidding, but it's a lot of money. Does it make sense to rely on a standard that is very, very expensive for people in developing nations to access?
Yeah, it is 168 Swiss francs, which I believe is about $168. The trouble out there is not enough certifiable programs. In many of the anti-bribery conventions now, there is a defence that if you have sufficient systems in place, you are not responsible, not held responsible of the so-called rogue employee. But what we see is that we like the ISO because it's one of the few systems that you can have certifiers come in and actually independently assess you. If there are alternatives, we'd be open to it. I know the Chartered Institute of Procurement and Supply has a course. That seems even more involved to me, and I think FIDIC has also some standards, but I think the FIDIC manuals are prohibitively expensive. So it's not the be and all and end all, but it's a start.
Okay, thanks for the questions. The suggestion to move the decision out of public procurement is also meant to wake you up a little bit. because, but the point is basically that if we have many different enforcement institutions that can impose reactions against companies when they have been involved in corruption or committed other forms of crime, then we get a very confusing enforcement landscape. And you know, also in economics, it is important to have predictable sanctions, predictable effects. And if we want to incentivize companies to self-report, it is, for example, we want companies to provide, it's so difficult to investigate and prosecute companies for corruption. So we want them to come and place some of the evidence on the table. And that is, if we want to offer some carrots for them to come and collaborate with law enforcers, then we cannot have many different law enforcement institutions that add a lot of unpredictable consequences for the companies that do come and try to collaborate. So it is very difficult to make use of these economic incentive mechanisms for that we can use in law enforcement like we do under competition law and leniency, right? So that is one of the reasons why we need to streamline the reactions a bit. And when a company has committed something illegal, like focus on corruption for now, they can be held liable, not under criminal law in all countries, but in all countries have some form of corporate liability. So it is possible to give them a fine. It's possible to have asset recovery. It's possible to claim compensation. And if we have public procurement reactions on top of that, and they are very done on a discretionary basis, and if we don't think they help very much, maybe we should do something else on that. So that is one of the reasons why, but also the fact that the rules have really been introduced as if we can have full trust in procurement agents. And that is really a concern in this context. But there are examples where procurement agents have been offered bribes to undebar a company. So it is an additional regulatory decision that can be exploited for corruption, which is very, yeah. So I think there's something we need to do on this. And I wonder if I can just add one example about an example where this is that explains that something about this counterintuitive effect. In Norway, we had a case against a company, a big company called Norconsult, and that company had paid bribes in Tanzania. And in Norway, that company was debarred from the World Bank. And there was so clear evidence, so even if the Norwegian government, they did not want to investigate it, but it was so obvious they had to do something. And then they investigated the company, and the case went up to the highest court, and the highest court decided that the corporation cannot be held criminally liable because that will lead to debarment under public procurement law in Norway. And that is written in the judgment. This is really, if you think criminal law in a murder case, this is the same as saying we cannot put the murderer in prison because then he cannot take care of his old mother. So it is really, the company could not be found guilty because the consequences of a punishment would lead to debarment. And in the court decision, in the judgment, it is also written that the company has already been debarred by the World Bank, so it has in a sense been a bit punished. So all in all, it's not reasonable to find the company guilty. So the higher court decided that only 2 representatives of the company could be held individually liable. This is one example that shows the difficulties in practice. So of course it was reasonable. It was a reasonable situation because for the government in Norway, it was a tough thing to debar a company that it has so many contracts with. So they had to do something, but they have also introduced the rules that are, in a sense, ridiculous. So that was a long answer to one of the reasons why we really need to do something about this.
Hello. My name is Sandro Kevkashvili. I represent IDFI, an NGO based in Georgia. My question is to Mr. Jackolt. I apologize in advance, it's not about debarment. In your final slide, the final thoughts, one of the points was that e-procurement cannot, you don't think e-procurement is a solution for corruption and collusion. Can you elaborate on the reasoning behind that? Because it seems to me that designing an e-procurement system is a perfect opportunity to actually reduce opportunities for corruption by automating certain stages and reducing human-to-human contacts. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much for that question. I mean, my point is not that it's bad to have e-procurement. For sure, it is very good. And one thing that it definitely helps with is process mistakes. And that is something that I see from a practical procurement point of view happens all the time. These are things which are, as you know, in public procurement, you're sort of painting yourself into a corner the further you go down the procurement process. And if you do mistakes which are, I would call them innocent, it's very difficult sometimes to repair these kind of things. And that is what I think that let's say the system helps out very much with. But I don't think it is right to market e-procurement as a panacea for fighting corruption. Yes, it may help because it may reinforce further transparency and maybe in some cases also limit ability to tamper with evaluations. I don't think it will do that when it comes to a big works contract, for instance, because there's no way that you can evaluate a works contract in an e-tick box type of environment. That is not going to help. It's not going to work, in my opinion. So you need to take out that information, and that means the moment you take it out, you're in the same situation anyway. So I think it's just this notion that once an e-procurement system is established in the country, then no more fraud and corruption. It's been sort of perceived as such, and I think that it's a little bit dangerous to have that kind of message. Yes, of course, it should be supported because it is a good way of doing procurement, but it may even lead to other types of ways of corruption. So I think one needs to be a bit careful with that message, and that was really my point with it. Yeah.
If I may add just very quickly, just one point. Our master, when it started in 2004, was named Master of E-Procurement because at the time we all believed that with e-procurement the solutions to all the sins of the world would have been found. Then we switched a few years later to procurement management, keeping a module of e-procurement, thinking that it was important, but realizing that to solve the sins of the world, there was much more involved.
Very quickly to finish on that. I mean, I know the Georgian system, but I also know that I'm not going to say Georgia in this, in other countries, e-procurement covers only part of the procurement, So that means that you leave a lot to outside. And if you look at especially what is outside the system, you will find a lot of direct contracting and weird forms which have been very nicely left out, So if the perception is, because this country has now introduced e-procurement, now they are really, really good and banks should allow national system to prevail, etc., then it doesn't give you the full picture. But, yeah, just as an example.
Graciela Miralles from the World Bank. One thing that I just wanted to add to Tina's proposal is that, and somehow react to your comment before, is that of course we understand that a lot of the problems of procurement are related with vested interests, political economy issues, and externalizing the looking into procurement complaints into the competition agency is not just like a new idea, it's out there in some of the client countries of the World Bank. For instance, in the context of Ukraine, where they are extremely concerned about procurement and corruption, this is what they have done. Actually, the agency that is in charge of looking at complaints from the behavior of the companies, not in the context of bid rigging, but in the context of the appeal board, is the Competition Authority of Ukraine. So from that perspective, I just wanted to bring it as an example, and I just want to say that maybe in the context of the US, it would be unthinkable that the FTC was going to debar Boeing, yes, and potentially our colleagues in Ukraine would have a lot of trouble to debar some of the biggest companies in Ukraine. But the model and the fact that it creates another tool for checks and balances should be taken into account. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, that sounds was a good example to be aware of. Oh, sorry, yeah, and especially what we see is that in Eastern European countries, we see that there is a very clear relationship between the use of sole source procurement and the perceived extent of corruption. So it's definitely a very important environment to think about that. And what I also seen is that in the countries where they are extremely proud of e-procurement system, the share of contracts that are offered outside the e-procurement system can be, well, at least 50% or so in some countries. So there are some very good examples and tools, and also the situation is so challenging, it's really important to hold focus on these solutions. And I just wanted to commend also some of the points from EBRD that I think your point on third-party evaluation is a very, very reasonable point, and also the focus that you said that this is a development bank and we should focus on the price-quality combination, and that is also exactly the point with public procurement agents, and one of the reasons why if we add another goal, assessment of the integrity of suppliers, that is really something that disturbs a little bit the price-quality focus, in the sense that because it provides not only a focus on integrity, but also an opportunity to exclude bidders and so on. So it's, I think that it makes sense to have a focus on the price-quality combination. However, I wanted to add that development banks have significant influence, and you mentioned that it is difficult for a development bank to that you had to accept information provided by the suppliers, and audits could only be demanded if it was part of the contract and so on. But development banks cross the bar, so they can already use that tool and go together and cross the bar. So I just wanted to ask also, why can they not cross demand integrity on the side of governments? So they can put more pressure on the government side in combination, but they don't. They only use that power vis-a-vis the corporations. And that is something that I find a little bit puzzling, but of course it makes sense in a political economy perspective, but there is really an opportunity to use authority if they want to. And that is something I wanted to just ask you a little bit about, if it is possible to do more.
Yes, just briefly. Well, we are engaged in a lot of dialogue with national governments and in partnership with the other MDBs, but we're a development bank. You know, we exist to improve the world, to make things better. And if our only weapon is to withdraw the funding and to not work with the government, we don't think that's a very optimal outcome. On the margins, we can and we do put pressure I think in Ukraine in particular, we've really explained in no uncertain terms how unacceptable the situation is and how it's going to be very difficult for us to continue to work there. But it would be a shame we have to remove that development aid from that country as a result. In terms of leveraging, I think we can do a lot more to cooperate and work as one lot of MDBs together in partnership. I think that is an area we should explore further.
Aris Georgopoulos from the University of Nottingham. I have a question for Tina. You mentioned in your paper, and then you had a slide as well, comparing the deterrence effect and the difference of deterrence effect of debarment depending on how many players there are in a specific market. Now, I can understand the point from a theoretical point of view, although still I think I have to think even at the theoretical level whether that is the case, but let's assume that is the case. It's based on an assumption that debarment functions only in one market. Meaning, if it is a company in a market with few players that is debarred, it assumes that that debarment will not have effect in another market in which the company can participate. So I think the issue of debarment and the effect of deterrence is based on the fact that a company that is debarred cannot or will find it, if debarment is followed through, not like in the Norwegian case that you mentioned, will find it difficult to participate in other markets with many or fewer players. And also the analysis that you made, and I don't know in the paper if you have other paradigms, focused on the bribing issue, right? So I pay the bribe in order to have access in a smaller market. What is the cross-benefit effect? But of course, debarment, as you mentioned very well, in the context of procurement, affects other contexts. Use of child labor, for example, competition and collusion. So in that context, the overall debarment effect or the deterrence effect of debarment should be, in the context of collusion, be looked together with, I don't know, criminal liability or other competition law issues that we saw yesterday. So I'm just wondering whether your paper looks at these issues as well, or whether it focuses only on bribery. Thank you.
Thank you. I think I'm very glad that you raised those questions. Well, first, to the question of a single market versus universal market, that is addressed in the paper, in the analysis. So if you look at carefully on the model, you will see that we do take into account the impact of one universal market versus one market with an opportunity to go to other markets. So the difference is actually discussed in the paper, and we find that our conclusions are robust. They hold for both situations. But of course, you're totally right that an economic analysis depends on the assumptions that we made, and they have to be simple in order to understand a specific tool. So it has been looked at in a narrow sense. However, what you point at is this sum of several effects, the total effect. But what I discussed yesterday is, and also mentioned briefly now, is that when companies have settled a case under criminal law, it is normally automatically self-cleaned. So you lose the debarment effect that you could have had if the company has been found guilty in corruption, and that is and settle the case. Now, there is some variation across countries. So in some countries, because as mentioned, there is variation in how countries have taken this procurement directive into their countries, so into their systems. And in some countries, they say they will debar, even if there has been a settlement. But most countries will use that as a good reason for finding the company the supplier eligible for bidding. So the sum of those two effects will not really lead to a more deterrent effect. It will have the opposite effect, actually. So I'm not saying that it cannot have an effect, but the fact that we have not included the total set of consequences will not be discussed. But if you look at this other paper, we also discuss how public procurement fits with these other mechanisms. Well, if you have a settlement case, how it will affect the other reactions. And we explain how the total set of consequences is reduced and it doesn't add and add and add to the deterrent effect. And that is important to understand, because if we simply look at the enforcement institutions, they look very good on paper, but the reality may be different.
Say something about deterrence very quickly. I think we're talking a lot about specific deterrence. I think the MDB debarment regime works on a general deterrence. It keeps honest people honest. If you're going to be dishonest and corrupt, you'll always be corrupt. I don't think debarment is much of an impediment. But if you're thinking about it and you see the regime, then it may hopefully tip you into being honest. The general deterrence is key for us.
To be tested. Should be tested. Giancarlo, to close, we're done. Last question.
No problems. Just to contribute to the economics of debarment. So their analysis assumed some things. So if you think about the economics of debarment would never be optimal. Okay, if you had the possibility to use all the tools, debarment introduces an inefficiency. If the firm was eligible to bid because it's a good firm and misbehave, excluding it burns money on the table. You can do exactly the same by asking for a fine or damages of the same value of the cost of being debarred. So you would never use that. So I think the focus of the debate would be on how easy it is and how politically acceptable it is to debar a firm rather than have a fine which has the same value as the cost of debarment. If you remember the Siemens case, when Siemens was caught by the Americans, bribing every single buyer in the world for 20 years with a systematic budget for that, they paid the biggest fine ever paid in the US not to be debarred. So probably the value of debarment was 10 times higher. We'll never know, but nobody had the guts to use such a fine. So I think the debate on debarment should be on what is politically feasible more than what is economic efficiency, because efficiency would say you should never debar. You should fine or handicap in future auctions, because then the guy will be still there, maybe with a handicap, and compete and improve competition. And the second point is about third-party monitoring. I mean, since the Roman law, everything is third-party monitored, but some rules that are easy to be monitored by random audits. So every procurement agency has third-party monitors. What we said this morning, and Chris was not there, is that in the case of discretionary enforcement, as is often the case, debarment, where you can choose how long and if, then it's very dangerous to give this power to the buyer, because the buyer has a conflict of interest. Then I agree that Bill Kovacs would say never to the competition authority, but I think his view is that the competition authority is such a well-functioning animal with a very precise objective that you would spoil their work by giving to him to that. So you should have a other type of third agency, and there are many. Thank you.
Questions? Jack, Tina, Ron?
I'll just react to this question that you can buy your way out of debarment by paying an equivalent economic value. Every company we've ever sat down with has offered to buy their way out. And they see it as a risk-free reward, that if they get caught, they pay a fine, they continue. If they don't get caught, then it's the same. It doesn't get general deterrence up. It is something that is constantly put to us. I know our colleagues in the African Development Bank have recently tried that approach with 2 entities. As MDBs, we've heavily criticised them for that approach. And we say it is the wrong thing to do. There's a moral justification also for what we're trying to do. And there's also public funds involved. So we think there's more than just an economic argument to be put.
Tina, hold on. Very fast, because we're really running out of time.
I have a comment on Tina's paper.
Can you state your name again?
Hamid Sharif from Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, AIIB. I have an observation that I think it was telling that you said that the EU carries out 2.7 trillion euros worth of procurement, and yet only 16 firms have been debarred, and yet you contrast that with the MDBs, which do a fraction of that, and they have debarred over 1,000 firms and individuals. Two observations. One, that you have a separation from procurement and the integrity people. It's the integrity people who are actually making those decisions, and a separate system. So your point about the separation is borne out. Secondly, I think it's about the burden of proof, because the MDBs take the view that this is an administrative procedure, and therefore on a balance of probabilities, we choose not to deal with certain firms. We don't have the onus to discharge the criminal burden of proof, which might be the reason why you're seeing so little debarments in the national systems, because when you're saying firms are corrupt, you have to prove that to a very high level. And if we had to do that, we probably couldn't do it either.
Very, very fast.
Well, first, thanks to Giancarlo for the comments. I totally agree that we have to consider what kind of enforcement strategies work best in a total, and also when it comes to, when I referred to the competition authority, but what we describe in the paper is actually a market protection agency with some kind of broader mandate. But then keep in mind, Tommaso Valetti yesterday commented that putting too much authority in one institution is not a good idea for in terms of checks and balances. So that is another concern. And I just also wanted to mention that a very good point on development banks, that there is actually a separation of authority. And I just wanted to add that it is possible to reduce the burden on proof also at the national level if we turn this into an administrative regulatory decision where you don't have to prove corruption, but you can where you demand a certain level of compliance by the company. So it's possible to turn it around, like the British have done in their UK anti-bribery law, where they say if companies don't have this and that in place, we can hold you liable on an administrative level. So, but that is a different approach, and we cannot go into that debate now. But there are different regulatory systems that can reduce the burden of proof. So it makes it possible to react.
I think it was a wonderful debate, a wonderful start for the conference. I would take a little bit less than 30 minutes for the coffee break, maybe 20 minutes, and we're back there because we have a very, very interesting discussion on a very hot topic with two fantastic speakers. Thank you for the speakers of this wonderful session. Very nice.